There are men who climb toward power with steady hands, building their empires stone by stone. And then there are those who tear the world open with fire and ambition, believing themselves architects of destiny. Benito Mussolini was the latter. Born into poverty on the ragged edge of Italy, he rose from nothing to reshape a nation in his image. He promised glory. He promised strength. He promised a return to the days when Rome ruled the world. But beneath the marble monuments and the roaring crowds, beneath the theatrics and the iron fist, lay something darker. A hunger that could never be satisfied. A vision that demanded blood. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and still, we walk beside the man who once stood on balconies and declared himself invincible. We trace the arc of his rise, the shadows of his choices, and the inevitable fall that comes to all who mistake cruelty for greatness. This is not just history. This is the story of how one man's dream became a nation's nightmare. So close your eyes, let your breath slow, and drift with me into the shadows of the past. Let these words carry you gently into sleep, as we uncover the evil life of Benito Mussolini. Before we begin this journey through the darkened corridors of history, I want you to know something. These stories are crafted with care, designed to guide you softly toward rest while the past unfolds around you. If these words bring you comfort, if they carry you closer to sleep, then let this channel stay by your side too. Subscribe, and let it become a quiet companion in your nights. There's no rush, no pressure. Just a gentle invitation to return, whenever you're ready, to more stories told in whispers and shadows. Now, settle deeper into your pillow. Let the world outside fade. And let us begin. The village of Predappio clung to the hills of the Romagna like something forgotten, a place of narrow stone houses and muddy roads that turned to rivers when the rains came. It was a village of blacksmiths and farmers, of men who worked iron and earth and cursed the priests and the landlords in equal measure. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, and in the winter the wind came down from the Apennines and cut through the streets like a blade. It was here, in the summer of 1883, that a boy was born to a blacksmith named Alessandro Mussolini and a schoolteacher named Rosa Maltoni. They named him Benito, after the Mexican revolutionary Benito Juarez, because Alessandro believed in revolution the way other men believed in God. Alessandro was a large man, thick-armed and loud, with a black beard and hands scarred from years at the forge. He was a socialist, a member of the First International, and he spent his evenings in the tavern arguing politics with other men who had nothing but anger and wine. He did not go to church. He did not bow to authority. He beat his sons when they disobeyed him, and he beat them when they did not. He believed that the world was ruled by violence and that only violence could change it. He read aloud from Marx and Bakunin to anyone who would listen, and when no one would listen, he read to himself. He was not a kind man, but he was not a weak one, and his son learned early that strength was the only currency that mattered. Rosa was different. She was small and quiet, with dark eyes and hands that were always moving, correcting schoolwork, mending clothes, preparing meals. She taught at the village school, where the children sat on wooden benches and recited prayers before their lessons. She believed in God, in duty, in respectability. She attended Mass every Sunday and made her children kneel beside her in the cold stone chapel, even though Alessandro refused to come. She tried to hold the family together, to keep the house clean and the children fed, to mediate between her husband's fury and the world's indifference. But she was exhausted. She had seen too many winters, too many empty plates, too many nights when Alessandro came home drunk and angry. She loved her children, but she could not protect them from the world they were born into. Benito grew up in the space between his father's violence and his mother's faith, and he learned to navigate both. He was not a large child, but he was quick and mean. He fought other boys in the streets, and he did not stop when they fell. At 9, he was sent to a boarding school run by Salesian priests, and within months he had been expelled for stabbing a classmate with a penknife during an argument. The wound was not deep, but the intent was clear. He was sent to another school, a secular one, and he stayed because he had no choice. He read voraciously, not because he loved learning but because he loved the feeling of knowing more than others. He discovered Nietzsche and became obsessed with the idea of the will to power, of the Übermensch who stood above morality and shaped the world through force of personality. He read Marx and believed, for a time, in the revolution his father preached. But he also read D'Annunzio and the Italian nationalists, and he felt stirred by their talk of glory and greatness and the resurrection of Rome. He became a schoolteacher because he needed work, but he hated it. He was poor, always poor, living in cramped rooms and eating bread and thin soup. He was arrogant and combative, and he alienated everyone around him. He drifted from town to town, from job to job, never staying long enough to build anything. He joined the Socialist Party and wrote for their newspapers, his prose sharp and inflammatory, full of rage at the ruling class and contempt for those who did not share his vision. But even then, there was something unstable in him, something that did not quite fit. He admired revolutionaries, but he also admired conquerors. He spoke of justice, but he dreamed of power. He believed in nothing completely, and he was loyal to no one. He moved to Switzerland to avoid military service, and there he lived as an exile, sleeping in parks and under bridges, arrested for vagrancy, deported back to Italy. He returned and was conscripted into the army, and he served his time without distinction. He went back to teaching, then to journalism, writing with increasing ferocity for socialist publications. He married a woman named Rachel Guidi, the daughter of his father's mistress, and she bore him children, but he was rarely home. He was consumed by ambition, by the need to be someone, to matter, to be remembered. He did not yet know what form that ambition would take, but he felt it inside him like a hunger that could not be satisfied. By 1912, he was the editor of Avanti, the most important socialist newspaper in Italy, and he was one of the most prominent voices on the Italian left. He was 30 years old, and he had clawed his way up from nothing. But he was not satisfied. He never would be. He was a man without loyalty, without restraint, without fear of consequence. He had learned from his father that the world belonged to those who were willing to take it, and from his mother that piety and patience were the virtues of the defeated. He had chosen his father's lesson, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. The boy from Predappio was ready to burn. By 1914, Benito Mussolini had become the voice of Italian socialism. As editor of Avanti, the official newspaper of the Socialist Party, he commanded a circulation of over 100,000 readers and wielded influence that extended far beyond the printed page. He wrote with a fury that matched his father's forge, his columns dense with invective against the bourgeoisie, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church. He called for general strikes, for the overthrow of the Italian state, for the dictatorship of the proletariat. He was 31 years old, and he had finally found a role that fit his ambition and his rage. He was not loved, but he was feared, and that was enough. He moved through Milan like a man who knew he mattered, his clothes cheap but his confidence absolute. He spoke at rallies in packed halls, his voice rising above the noise, his fists pounding the podium. He was the future, or so it seemed. But Mussolini was never a man of doctrine. He was a man of instinct, and his instincts were always tuned to power. He had read Marx, but he had also read Nietzsche, and he understood that ideas were weapons, not truths. Socialism gave him a platform, a language, an audience. It did not give him certainty. He believed in class struggle because it explained the world he came from, the poverty and the humiliation and the endless grinding weight of being born with nothing. But he did not believe in the working class as a moral force. He believed in force itself. He had spent his life watching men grovel and fight and die for scraps, and he had concluded that the only thing that mattered was who held the knife. When the Great War began in August 1914, the Italian Socialist Party took a clear position: absolute neutrality. The war was an imperialist conflict, a slaughter designed to enrich capitalists and monarchs while workers died in the mud. Mussolini, as editor of Avanti, was expected to echo this line, and at first he did. He wrote columns denouncing militarism, calling the war a crime against humanity, insisting that Italian workers had no reason to die for France or Austria or anyone else. But even as he wrote these words, something was shifting inside him. He watched the war unfold, the vast mobilization of nations, the intoxication of collective purpose, and he felt something he had not felt before: envy. The socialists were irrelevant. They were shouting into the void while history was being made elsewhere. The war was not an abstraction. It was real, and it was creating a new world, and Mussolini wanted to be part of it. In October 1914, Mussolini published an article in Avanti. That stunned his comrades. He called for Italy to abandon neutrality and enter the war. He did not frame it as a socialist position. He framed it as a revolutionary one. The war, he argued, was a crucible, a moment of transformation that could shatter the old order and open space for radical change. Neutrality was cowardice. Italy needed to act, to fight, to seize its place in the new Europe that would emerge from the ashes. The article was incendiary, and the reaction was immediate. The Socialist Party leadership was furious. They accused him of betraying the workers, of aligning himself with nationalists and warmongers. They demanded his resignation. He refused. A week later, the party expelled him. He was no longer a socialist. He was nothing. But Mussolini did not collapse. He pivoted. Within days, he founded a new newspaper, Illinois Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy. The name was telling. He was no longer speaking to the proletariat. He was speaking to the nation. The newspaper was funded by French industrialists and British intelligence operatives who saw value in an Italian editor willing to push for intervention. Mussolini did not care where the money came from. He had learned long ago that purity was a luxury only the powerless could afford. He wrote with the same fury he had always written with, but now his targets were different. He attacked the socialists as cowards and traitors. He called for war, for blood, for national greatness. He invoked the legacy of Rome, the glory of the Italian people, the necessity of violence. He was saying the opposite of what he had said months earlier, and he did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply acted as if the past had never existed. This was not a gradual evolution. It was not a rethinking of principles or a careful reassessment of strategy. It was an inversion, sudden and total. Mussolini had spent years building his identity as a socialist revolutionary, and he discarded it in a matter of weeks. He did not lose sleep over it. He did not agonize. He saw an opening, and he took it. The socialists had cast him out, but they had also freed him. He no longer had to pretend to care about the working class or the international solidarity of labor or any of the other abstractions that had never really moved him. He could speak directly to the things that did move him: power, glory, the will to dominate. He could become what he had always been beneath the rhetoric, a man without loyalty, without ideology, without restraint. The betrayal was noticed. His former comrades denounced him in the harshest terms. They called him a traitor, a Judas, a man who had sold his soul for foreign gold. They were right, but they were also irrelevant. Mussolini did not care what socialists thought of him anymore. He had discovered something more important than their approval. He had discovered that there was an audience for nationalism, for militarism, for the language of blood and soil. The war had awakened something in Italy, a hunger for meaning and purpose that socialism could not satisfy. People were tired of being told to wait for the revolution. They wanted something immediate, something visceral. Mussolini gave it to them. He told them they were great, that they were destined for glory, that the war was their chance to prove it. He told them that violence was not a crime but a necessity, that the future belonged to those willing to fight for it. And they listened. By early 1915, Italy was moving toward intervention. Nationalists, liberals, and pro-war socialists, men like Mussolini, organized massive demonstrations in favor of joining the Allies. They filled the streets of Milan and Rome, chanting slogans, waving flags, demanding action. The government, weak and indecisive, gave in. In May 1915, Italy entered the war. Mussolini had won. He had gone from expelled socialist to nationalist agitator in less than a year, and he had helped push his country into the greatest conflict in human history. He did not think about the men who would die. He thought about what the war would do for him. He had learned the most important lesson of his life. Ideology was a tool, not a truth. Loyalty was a weakness. The only thing that mattered was power, and power went to those who were willing to take it, no matter the cost. He had been a socialist because socialism gave him a platform. Now he was a nationalist because nationalism gave him a bigger one. He would change again if he needed to. He would say anything, betray anyone, destroy everything, if it brought him closer to what he wanted. He was not a man of principle. He was a man of appetite. And the war had shown him that the world rewarded appetite, not principle. The boy from Predappio had become something else. He had become a man who understood that history belonged to those who were ruthless enough to seize it. Mussolini volunteered for the Bersaglieri, the elite light infantry of the Italian army, in August 1915. He was 32 years old, too old to be conscripted, but he enlisted anyway because he needed to. He had spent months calling for war, demanding that others fight, and he understood that his credibility depended on his willingness to do the same. He could not remain in Milan writing editorials while younger men died in the trenches. He needed to prove that he was not just a voice but a body, not just an agitator but a soldier. He left his wife and children without ceremony and reported to a training camp near Verona. He was issued a rifle, a uniform, and a number. He became one of millions. The front was not what he had imagined. He had written about war as if it were a forge, a place where nations were purified and men were made strong. But the reality was mud and cold and the smell of latrines and rotting flesh. The Italian army was poorly supplied, poorly led, and poorly prepared. The soldiers wore thin uniforms in the Alpine winter and ate bread that was often moldy. They dug trenches in frozen ground and waited for orders that rarely made sense. The Austrians held the high ground along the Isonzo River, and the Italian generals sent wave after wave of men uphill into machine gun fire. Mussolini served in the trenches for nearly 2 years, and he learned what war actually was. It was not glory. It was endurance. It was the slow grinding down of the body and the mind until nothing remained but the will to survive. He kept a diary, scribbling entries by candlelight in dugouts that stank of sweat and smoke. He wrote about the cold, about the lice that crawled through his clothes, about the Austrian shells that landed without warning and turned men into pieces. He wrote about fear, though he did not call it that. He wrote about the other soldiers, most of them peasants who could barely read, who followed orders because they had no choice, who died without understanding why. He felt contempt for them, but he also felt kinship. They were all trapped in the same machine, and the machine did not care who they had been before. He was not a famous editor here. He was just another body in a trench, waiting for death or orders, whichever came first. In February 1917, Mussolini was stationed near the village of Duce when a mortar exploded during a training exercise. He was standing close, too close, and the blast tore through him. Shrapnel pierced his legs, his groin, his abdomen. He collapsed, blood pouring from dozens of wounds, metal fragments buried deep in his flesh. He was carried to a field hospital on a stretcher, unconscious, his uniform soaked red. The doctors counted over 40 pieces of shrapnel lodged in his body. They removed what they could, but some fragments were too deep, too close to arteries and organs. He would carry them for the rest of his life. He spent 5 months in military hospitals, undergoing surgery after surgery. The pain was constant, a grinding ache that morphed into sharp agony whenever the doctors cut into him again. He developed infections. He ran fevers. There were nights when he thought he would die, and nights when he wished he would. But he did not die. He endured. He lay in a hospital bed surrounded by other broken men, some missing limbs, some blinded, some so damaged they could not speak. He listened to them scream in the night. He watched them die. He absorbed it all, the suffering and the waste, and he drew his own conclusions. The war had not made Italy strong. It had exposed how weak the country was, how incompetent its leaders, how fragile its institutions. Democracy had failed. The politicians in Rome had sent men to die without a plan, without supplies, without even a coherent strategy. Mussolini lay in that hospital bed and decided that Italy needed something else. It needed order. It needed strength. It needed a man who understood that only force could impose discipline on chaos. When he was finally discharged in August 1917, he returned to Milan as a wounded veteran. He walked with a cane, his legs still stiff from the shrapnel wounds, his body marked by scars that would never fully heal. But he was also something new. He was a hero, or at least he could be presented as one. He had fought. He had bled. He had suffered. No one could accuse him of cowardice now. He returned to Il Popolo d'Italia and resumed writing, but his tone had changed. He no longer spoke in the language of revolution. He spoke in the language of war. He wrote about sacrifice, about discipline, about the need for a new kind of politics forged in the trenches. He wrote about the soldiers who had fought and died while the socialists and the pacifists had stayed home and complained. He wrote about betrayal, about the politicians who had sent men to die and then failed to honor their sacrifice. He was building a narrative, and he was placing himself at the center of it. He was the soldier prophet, the man who had seen the truth of war and returned to save Italy from itself. The war ended in November 1918, and Italy was on the winning side, but it did not feel like victory. The country had lost over 600,000 men, and the survivors returned to a nation that was collapsing. The economy was in ruins. Unemployment was rampant. Inflation destroyed savings. The government was paralyzed, unable to address the crisis, unable to maintain order. Strikes erupted across the north. Workers occupied factories. Peasants seized land. The socialists and the communists spoke of revolution, of Soviets, of the imminent overthrow of the bourgeois state. The middle class was terrified. The industrialists were desperate. The returning soldiers were angry. They had been promised glory and had been given mud. They had been promised land and had been given nothing. They wandered the streets in their uniforms, unemployed and bitter, looking for someone to blame. Mussolini saw the moment and understood it. The war had not ended. It had simply moved from the trenches to the streets. Italy was ungovernable, and whoever could impose order would control the country. The socialists were promising revolution, but they were too weak, too divided, too committed to democratic process. The liberals were clinging to institutions that no one believed in anymore. Mussolini offered something else. He offered violence organized into purpose. He offered a movement for the men who had fought and felt betrayed, for the middle class who feared the Bolsheviks, for the industrialists who needed someone to crush the strikes. He offered fascism, though the word was still new and its meaning still unclear. What mattered was not the ideology but the promise, strength, order, action. He would give them discipline. He would give them revenge. He would give them a future built on the logic of the trenches, where only the ruthless survived. He was no longer the boy from Predappio, no longer the socialist agitator, no longer just a wounded veteran. He was becoming something else, something harder and more dangerous. The war had not broken him. It had clarified him. It had stripped away whatever restraint he might have had and left only ambition and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. He had learned that the world respected only force, that democracy was an illusion maintained by those too weak to seize power directly. He had learned that men would follow anyone who promised them purpose and absolved them of doubt. He had learned that history was written by those who acted, not those who waited. And he was ready to act. The war had made him, and now he would make Italy. On March 23, 1919, Mussolini gathered fewer than 200 men in a rented hall on the Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan. The hall was small, its walls stained with damp, and the men who came were not representatives of any established political force. They were war veterans, futurist poets, disgruntled nationalists, former socialists like Mussolini himself, and young men with nothing to lose. Some wore pieces of their old uniforms. Others came in civilian clothes worn thin at the elbows. They sat on wooden chairs and smoked cigarettes and listened as Mussolini spoke about betrayal and renewal. He did not offer them a manifesto or a coherent ideology. He offered them action. He told them that Italy had been humiliated at Versailles, denied the territorial gains it had been promised, treated like a beggar by France and Britain. He told them that the socialists were planning a Bolshevik revolution, that they would hand Italy to Moscow and destroy everything the soldiers had died for. He told them that the liberals were weak, that democracy was a failure, that only direct action could save the country. He called his new movement the Fasci di Combattimento, the Combat Leagues. The name evoked the ancient Roman fasces, the bundle of rods and an axe that symbolized authority and collective strength. But the movement was not about symbolism. It was about violence. The early fascists were not a political party. They were a militia, a street gang with revolutionary pretensions. They had no electoral strategy, no organizational structure, no funding beyond what Mussolini could scrape together from his newspaper and a handful of wealthy donors. What they had was willingness to fight, to break, to terrorize. They adopted the black shirt as their uniform, borrowing the color from the Arditi, the elite shock troops who had fought in the trenches. They armed themselves with clubs, knives, and pistols. They moved through Milan in squads, looking for enemies. Their enemies were easy to find. The socialists and the anarchists held rallies and strikes almost daily, and the fascists attacked them. They broke up meetings, smashed printing presses, burned labor union offices. They beat organizers in the streets and left them bleeding on the cobblestones. The violence was not random. It was systematic, calculated to destroy the left's organizational capacity and to demonstrate that the fascists were stronger, more ruthless, more willing to cross lines that others would not. Mussolini did not participate in the street fighting himself. His body was still damaged from the war, and he was more valuable as a voice than as a fist. But he celebrated the violence in the pages of Il Popolo d'Italia. He wrote about the fascists as warriors, as the vanguard of a new Italy, as men who understood that politics was not debate but combat. He justified every attack, every beating, every burned building. He framed the socialists as traitors, as foreign agents, as enemies of the nation who deserved whatever they received. His rhetoric was not defensive. It was celebratory. He did not pretend that the fascists were acting in self-defense. He said openly that they were waging war, and that war required brutality. His readers, many of them veterans, many of them frightened by the strikes and the communist rhetoric, cheered him on. They saw the fascists as defenders, as the only force willing to stand against the red tide. By 1920, the fascist squads were spreading beyond Milan. They appeared in Bologna, in Ferrara, in the agricultural regions of the Po Valley, where socialist unions had organized tenant farmers and day laborers into powerful blocks. The landlords and the industrialists watched the fascist violence with interest. They had their own reasons to fear the socialists. The unions were demanding higher wages, shorter hours, land redistribution. The occupations of factories in the north had terrified the factory owners, who saw Bolshevism creeping into Italy. The liberals in government talked about reform, about compromise, but the landlords and the industrialists did not want compromise. They wanted the strikes crushed, the unions destroyed, the workers returned to submission. The fascists offered to do exactly that, and the landlords began to fund them. They provided money for weapons, for trucks, for gasoline. They provided logistical support, allowing the squads to use their estates as bases. They provided lists of names, union leaders, socialist organizers, troublemakers who needed to be dealt with. The violence intensified. Fascist squads raided villages in the middle of the night, dragging men from their beds and beating them in the streets. They forced union leaders to drink castor oil, a humiliating punishment that caused violent diarrhea and left victims weakened and degraded. They burned down socialist meeting halls, sometimes with people inside. They murdered. In some towns, they effectively overthrew local governments, driving elected officials into exile and installing their own men. The police watched and did nothing. The Carabinieri stood aside. The judiciary rarely prosecuted fascist violence, and when it did, the penalties were minimal. The Italian state, weakened and paralyzed, allowed the fascists to act as a parallel force, a private army that did what the government could not or would not do. This complicity was not accidental. Many officials, from local prefects to national politicians, saw the fascists as useful. They did not like the socialists either. They feared revolution, feared instability, feared that Italy was slipping into chaos. The fascists offered order, even if that order was imposed through terror. The liberal prime ministers, first Francesco Nitti, then Giovanni Giolitti, believed they could control Mussolini, that they could co-opt the fascists and neutralize them through inclusion in the political system. They were wrong. Mussolini had no interest in being co-opted. He wanted power, and he understood that power came from violence, not from parliamentary maneuvering. Every time the state failed to stop the fascist squads, every time the police stood aside, every time a court acquitted a fascist murderer, Mussolini grew stronger. The state was showing itself to be hollow, and the fascists were filling the vacuum. By 1921, the fascist movement had grown to over 200,000 members. Mussolini transformed the Fasci di Combattimento into the National Fascist Party, giving it the appearance of legitimacy, of structure. But the core remained the same. It was a movement built on violence, funded by elites, tolerated by the state, and directed by a man who understood that ideology was secondary to force. Mussolini still did not have a coherent program. He borrowed from nationalism, from syndicalism, from futurism, from whatever seemed useful at the moment. He praised capitalism when speaking to industrialists and attacked it when speaking to workers. He claimed to represent the nation but defined the nation as whatever served his purposes. What unified fascism was not a set of beliefs but a method, the systematic use of terror to destroy political opponents and to create the conditions for authoritarian rule. The socialists tried to fight back, but they were divided, disorganized, and committed to legal methods that no longer mattered. They held meetings while the fascists burned their offices. They filed complaints while the fascists beat their members. They believed in the rule of law while the law stood aside and watched them die. The communists were more willing to fight, but they were too few and too late. The liberal state, clinging to the illusion of normalcy, refused to declare martial law, refused to ban the fascist squads, refused to confront the violence that was tearing the country apart. Democracy was failing not because the Italian people rejected it but because the institutions meant to protect it would not act. The fascists did not seize power through popular uprising. They seized it because the state allowed them to, because the elites funded them, because the police protected them, and because no one with the power to stop them was willing to do so. Mussolini had found his method, and it was working. Violence had become politics, and politics had become war. By the autumn of 1922, Italy was on the edge of collapse. The government had changed hands 5 times in 4 years. Strikes paralyzed the industrial north. Fascist squads controlled entire provinces, imposing their own order through violence that the state no longer pretended to resist. Prime Minister Luigi Facta, a liberal bureaucrat without vision or authority, presided over a parliament that could barely form a quorum. The socialists and the communists hated each other almost as much as they hated the fascists. The Catholics sat in the center, paralyzed by indecision. The liberals, who had governed Italy since unification, were exhausted, their credibility destroyed by years of failure. No one believed in the system anymore. The question was not whether democracy would survive but what would replace it. Mussolini intended to provide the answer. In mid-October, Mussolini met with fascist leaders in Milan and outlined a plan. They would organize a mass mobilization of black shirts, converging on Rome from across the country. The march would be presented as a popular uprising, a national movement demanding change. But it was also a threat. If the government resisted, the fascists would fight. If the king did not yield, there would be civil war. Mussolini was gambling that neither the government nor the king had the will to stop him. He was right. The plan was audacious and absurd in equal measure. The fascist squads were not a real army. They had no tanks, no artillery, no unified command structure. Most of them were armed with clubs and hunting rifles. If the Italian army had been ordered to stop them, the march would have ended in slaughter. But Mussolini understood something the liberals did not. Power was not about force alone. It was about will, and the Italian state had none left. On October 27, thousands of black shirts began moving toward Rome. They came by train, by truck, on foot. They gathered in towns surrounding the capital, Civitavecchia, Monterotondo, Tivoli, camping in fields, sleeping in barns, waiting for orders. Many were young, barely out of their teens, wearing black shirts and armbands, carrying makeshift weapons. They sang fascist anthems and chanted Mussolini's name. The atmosphere was part carnival, part military mobilization. It rained heavily, turning the roads to mud, soaking the men who had no shelter. They were cold, wet, disorganized. But they were there, and that was enough. The march was as much spectacle as threat, a performance designed to create the impression of unstoppable momentum. Mussolini remained in Milan, waiting by the telephone, editing his newspaper, refusing to commit himself until he knew the outcome. He would not risk being arrested or killed leading a failed coup. If the march succeeded, he would take credit. If it failed, he would deny involvement. In Rome, Prime Minister Facta met with his cabinet in a state of near panic. Reports were flooding in about the fascist mobilization, about their numbers, about their intentions. Facta understood that the government had two options: resist or surrender. Resistance meant declaring martial law and ordering the army to disperse the black shirts by force. Surrender meant negotiating with Mussolini and bringing him into the government. Facta, to his credit, chose resistance. He drafted a decree declaring a state of siege, mobilizing the army, and authorizing the use of lethal force against the fascists. The decree was presented to King Victor Emmanuel III for signature. Without the king's approval, it was meaningless. Everything depended on what the king would do. Victor Emmanuel III was a small man, physically and temperamentally. He was cautious, anxious, and deeply aware of his own limitations. He had reigned since 1900, surviving scandals and political crises by avoiding decisive action whenever possible. He feared revolution. He feared the socialists. He feared that if the fascists were crushed, the left would rise up and sweep away the monarchy. He also feared civil war, feared bloodshed, feared making the wrong decision and being blamed for it. He consulted with military advisors, who assured him that the army could stop the march. He consulted with conservative politicians, who urged him to appoint Mussolini and avoid conflict. He spent the night of October 27 pacing the halls of the Quirinal Palace, unable to sleep, unable to decide. In the early hours of October 28, he made his choice. He refused to sign the martial law decree. Without it, Facta's government collapsed. The prime minister resigned. The king sent a telegram to Mussolini in Milan, inviting him to Rome to form a new government. Mussolini received the telegram on the morning of October 28. He read it, smiled, and boarded a train. He did not march on Rome. He traveled in a first-class compartment, wearing a black shirt and a bowler hat, looking like a provincial politician on his way to a meeting. The black shirts were still camped outside the city, wet and cold, waiting for orders that never came. They would be allowed to parade through Rome later, after everything was decided, a victory march that celebrated a conquest that had not actually occurred. Mussolini arrived at the train station on the morning of October 30 and was driven to the palace. He met with the king, and the king appointed him prime minister. He was 39 years old. He had been given power by a monarch too frightened to resist, and he had achieved it without firing a shot. The transfer of power was legal, constitutional, and entirely hollow. Mussolini had not won an election. He had not overthrown the government. He had been invited to lead it because the existing leadership had collapsed under the weight of its own incompetence and fear. The March on Rome was not a revolution. It was a bluff that succeeded because no one called it. The Italian state had the means to stop Mussolini. It had the army, the police, the legal authority. What it lacked was the will. The liberals believed they could control him, that they could use him to stabilize the country and then ease him out once the crisis passed. They believed he was just another politician, ambitious and opportunistic but ultimately manageable. They were catastrophically wrong. Mussolini understood what they did not. He had been given an opening, and he would use it to destroy the system that had elevated him. He was not interested in being prime minister within a democratic framework. He was interested in power, absolute and unconstrained. But he was also patient. He would not move too quickly. He would consolidate, maneuver, eliminate opposition step by step. He would use the appearance of legality to mask the reality of dictatorship. He had learned from his years as a socialist and his years as a fascist that timing mattered, that you took what you could when you could, and that you never stopped until there was nothing left to take. He formed a coalition government, including liberals and Catholics and even a few moderate fascists. He gave speeches about national unity and reconciliation. He reassured the king, the Vatican, the industrialists. He played the role of the responsible statesman, the man who had saved Italy from chaos. But he was already planning the next step. He was in office, but he was not yet in power. That would come later, and it would come through the same method that had brought him this far: violence, patience, and the willingness to do what others would not. Mussolini took office as prime minister on October 31, 1922, and immediately began the work of consolidation. He did not announce that he intended to destroy Italian democracy. He spoke instead of order, stability, and national renewal. He formed a coalition cabinet that included liberals, Catholics, and nationalists alongside his fascists. He reassured Parliament that he respected constitutional norms. He told the king that he was a loyal servant of the crown. But behind this facade of moderation, he was methodically dismantling every institution that could resist him. He moved carefully, testing boundaries, exploiting weaknesses, never taking more than he thought he could hold. He understood that dictatorship was not built in a day. It was built through 1,000 small surrenders, each one justified as temporary, necessary, pragmatic. Within weeks, he demanded and received emergency powers from Parliament. The justification was simple: Italy was in crisis, and crisis required decisive action. The liberals, desperate to restore order, agreed. They granted him the authority to govern by decree for 1 year, bypassing parliamentary debate. Mussolini used these powers to expand the fascist squads, integrating them into a new national militia, the Voluntary Militia for National Security, or MVSN. This was not a police force. It was a private army, loyal to Mussolini alone, funded by the state but answerable to no one but him. The militia wore black shirts and swore an oath not to the king or to Italy but to Mussolini personally. The liberal ministers who had approved the emergency powers watched in discomfort as the fascists consolidated their grip, but they said nothing. They had already conceded the principle. The rest was simply execution. Mussolini moved next against the press. He did not ban newspapers outright. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, he pressured editors, both through legal means and through violence. Fascist squads raided the offices of opposition newspapers, smashing presses and beating journalists. Editors who did not cooperate found themselves arrested on spurious charges or driven into exile. Mussolini passed laws requiring all journalists to be registered with a fascist-controlled guild. Those who refused lost their right to work. Slowly, methodically, the independent press was strangled. By 1924, most newspapers either supported the regime or remained silent. Criticism became dangerous, and danger led to silence. The public, already exhausted by years of instability, did not protest. They wanted peace, and Mussolini gave them the appearance of it. He called elections in April 1924, but they were not free. The fascist militia intimidated opposition candidates. Ballot boxes were stuffed. Voters were threatened. The fascists won a large majority, not because they were popular but because the system had been corrupted beyond repair. One of the few opposition voices who remained was Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist deputy who had the courage to stand in parliament and expose the fraud. On May 30, 1924, he delivered a speech detailing the violence, the intimidation, the rigging of the elections. He demanded that the results be annulled. He spoke for over an hour, methodically laying out the evidence. The fascist deputies shouted at him, threatened him, but he did not stop. He finished his speech and left the chamber. 10 days later, he was kidnapped. Matteotti was walking near his home in Rome when a black car pulled up beside him. 5 men jumped out, grabbed him, and forced him into the vehicle. He fought. He screamed. Witnesses saw the car speed away. His body was found 2 months later in a shallow grave outside the city. He had been stabbed repeatedly. The murder was traced to fascist operatives, men with direct ties to Mussolini's inner circle. The evidence was overwhelming. Mussolini denied any involvement, but no one believed him. The public was outraged. Even conservative politicians who had tolerated the fascists were horrified. For a moment, it seemed as if the regime might collapse. Opposition deputies walked out of parliament in protest, forming what they called the Aventine Secession, refusing to return until justice was done. They believed that moral outrage would force the king to dismiss Mussolini. They were wrong. Victor Emmanuel III did nothing. He met with Mussolini, expressed concern, but took no action. He did not dismiss the prime minister. He did not call new elections. He did not order an investigation. The king was afraid of the fascists, afraid of civil war, afraid of making a decision that might weaken the monarchy. The liberals and the Catholics, who controlled the majority of parliament outside the fascists, also did nothing. They condemned the murder in speeches but refused to act. They believed that withdrawing from parliament was a principled stand, but all it did was remove the last obstacle to Mussolini's dominance. The opposition had walked out, and the fascists now controlled the chamber without resistance. Mussolini waited. He watched the outrage build and then dissipate. He watched the opposition fracture and lose momentum. He watched the king fail to act. And then, in January 1925, he delivered a speech to parliament that ended any pretense of democratic governance. He did not apologize for Matteotti's murder. He did not deny responsibility. Instead, he stood at the podium and declared that if fascism was a criminal conspiracy, then he alone was responsible for everything it had done. He said that he could have turned the chamber into a barracks, that he could have dissolved parliament by force, but that he had chosen restraint. He said that the opposition had accused him of violence, and he accepted the charge. He said that Italy needed a strong hand, and he would provide it. It was not an apology. It was a declaration of dictatorship. He was daring them to stop him, and no one did. Within months, Mussolini passed a series of laws that formalized his absolute power. He banned all opposition parties. He censored the press completely. He dissolved independent trade unions. He created the OVRA, a secret police force tasked with hunting down dissidents. The OVRA arrested thousands, held them without trial, tortured them in prisons scattered across the country. Opponents of the regime were beaten, exiled, or murdered. Some fled abroad. Others simply disappeared. The machinery of totalitarianism was being assembled piece by piece, law by law, arrest by arrest. Democracy did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It collapsed through accumulated surrender, through 1,000 decisions by politicians, judges, police officers, and ordinary citizens to look away, to stay silent, to accept the new reality because resistance seemed futile or dangerous. Mussolini did not invent totalitarianism, but he perfected a method for achieving it within a constitutional framework. He used legal mechanisms to destroy legality. He used democratic institutions to dismantle democracy. He exploited every weakness in the Italian state, the king's cowardice, the liberals' exhaustion, the left's disunity, the public's desperation for order, and turned those weaknesses into instruments of control. By the end of 1925, Italy was no longer a democracy. It was a dictatorship, and Mussolini was no longer just prime minister. He was Il Duce, the leader, a man who claimed to embody the will of the nation and who tolerated no opposition. He had achieved what he set out to achieve, not through popular revolution but through the systematic exploitation of a political system too weak to defend itself. The liberals who had invited him into government believing they could control him were gone, purged or cowed into submission. The socialists who had once been his comrades were in exile or in prison. The king, who could have stopped him, had chosen not to. Mussolini stood alone at the center of power, and there was no one left who could challenge him. The totalitarian state was built, and it had been built not by force alone but by the complicity of those who should have resisted and chose not to. By 1926, Mussolini's face was inescapable. It stared from posters pasted on the walls of every town and village in Italy, from the Alps to Sicily. It appeared in schoolbooks, above the desks of classrooms where children learned to read by spelling out his name. It flickered across newsreels in darkened cinemas, always in motion, always speaking, always commanding. His image was printed on postcards, calendars, commemorative plates. Shopkeepers displayed his portrait beside the crucifix. Farmers hung it in their kitchens. He was everywhere, and the ubiquity was intentional. The regime understood that power was not just about control but about presence, about creating the sense that Mussolini was not merely a man but a force, eternal and omnipresent. He was no longer Benito Mussolini, the blacksmith's son from Predappio. He was Il Duce, the leader, and the cult built around him was designed to make Italians forget he had ever been anything else. The construction of the cult began with language. Mussolini was never referred to simply by name in official documents or newspapers. He was Il Duce, always capitalized, always singular. The regime manufactured titles and epithets that elevated him beyond human limitation. He was the founder of the empire, the restorer of Rome, the man of providence. He was described as tireless, never sleeping, working through the night while others rested. Stories circulated about his physical prowess, his ability to fly planes, ride horses, fence with expert swordsmen, harvest wheat alongside peasants. None of these stories needed to be true. They needed only to be repeated until they became part of the national consciousness. Propaganda was not about convincing people of facts. It was about creating a mythology so pervasive that questioning it felt like betrayal. Mussolini collaborated enthusiastically in his own deification. He understood instinctively that image was power, and he stage-managed his public appearances with the precision of a theater director. He appeared on balconies above vast crowds, his arms crossed, his jaw thrust forward, his body rigid and commanding. He gave speeches in a style that was more performance than oration, his voice rising and falling in exaggerated cadences, his gestures broad and theatrical. He would pause for effect, letting silence hang in the air, and then explode into rage or triumph, his words echoing across the piazza. The crowds roared in response, not because they understood every word but because the spectacle demanded participation. To stand silent was to be excluded, to be suspect. So they cheered, and the cheering became part of the ritual, proof that the cult was working. He posed for photographs constantly, and each photograph was carefully composed to convey a specific image. He appeared shirtless in wheat fields, a sickle in his hand, his chest bare, sweat glistening on his skin. The message was clear: he was a man of the people, a worker, a symbol of virility and strength. He appeared in military uniforms, surrounded by officers, inspecting troops, riding in motorcades. The message was equally clear: he was a warrior, a commander, the embodiment of the nation's martial spirit. He appeared in formal dress at state functions, shaking hands with foreign dignitaries, presiding over ceremonies. The message: he was a statesman, respected and feared by the world. Every image reinforced the mythology. Every image erased the reality of who he actually was, a provincial journalist with a checkered past, a man who had betrayed every principle he once claimed to hold, a dictator whose power rested on violence and fear. The regime extended the cult into every corner of Italian life. School children began each day by reciting oaths of loyalty to Il Duce. Textbooks were rewritten to portray him as the savior of Italy, the man who had rescued the nation from chaos and restored its greatness. History was reinterpreted through the lens of fascism, with Mussolini cast as the heir to Augustus and Julius Caesar, the latest in a line of great men destined to lead Rome. The connection to ancient Rome was not subtle. The regime adopted Roman symbols, the fasces, the eagle, the salute with the outstretched arm. Mussolini spoke constantly of empire, of recreating the glory of the Caesars, of making the Mediterranean an Italian lake once again. The rhetoric was absurd, disconnected from Italy's actual capabilities, but it resonated because it offered grandeur in place of the mundane reality of poverty and stagnation. Italians were told they were not struggling citizens of a weak state but the descendants of conquerors, and all they had to do was believe in Il Duce. The cult was enforced not just through propaganda but through ritual and compulsion. Public festivals and anniversaries became occasions for mass displays of loyalty. The anniversary of the March on Rome was celebrated as a national holiday, with parades and speeches and mandatory attendance. Fascist organizations enrolled millions of Italians, youth groups, women's groups, workers' syndicates, all designed to integrate the population into the regime and to make participation in the cult a condition of social and economic survival. To refuse to join was to mark oneself as suspect, to risk losing a job, a promotion, access to services. The regime did not need everyone to believe. It needed everyone to perform belief, and performance was enough. Over time, the line between performance and genuine conviction blurred. People repeated the slogans so often that they stopped questioning them. Children who grew up reciting oaths to Il Duce knew no other reality. The cult became self-sustaining, a closed system that defined loyalty as obedience and obedience as patriotism. Yet the man at the center of the cult remained deeply ordinary. Mussolini was vain, insecure, and prone to petty cruelties. He demanded constant flattery from subordinates and flew into rages when contradicted. He had affairs with dozens of women, some willing, others coerced, and he kept records of his conquests as if they were military victories. He suffered from stomach ulcers, likely caused by stress and his erratic diet. He spent hours posing for photographs and obsessing over his public image while ignoring the actual work of governance. He made decisions impulsively, often based on emotion rather than analysis. He was not a genius. He was not a visionary. He was a mediocre man elevated by circumstance, ambition, and the machinery of totalitarian control. But the cult made him untouchable. It surrounded him with a mythology so thick that reality could not penetrate. Critics were silenced, dissidents disappeared, and the population was taught to see him not as he was but as the regime said he was. The cult of Il Duce was not unique to Italy. It would be replicated by other dictators in other countries, refined and intensified. But Mussolini pioneered the model, demonstrating how a modern state could use mass media, education, and compulsory participation to transform a political leader into a sacred figure. The cult was not merely propaganda. It was a system of emotional control, designed to make Italians dependent on Mussolini for their sense of identity and purpose. They were taught to love him, to fear disappointing him, to believe that without him Italy would collapse back into the chaos from which he claimed to have rescued it. The trains did not run on time. The economy was stagnant. Corruption was rampant. The regime brutalized its citizens and squandered resources on vanity projects. But the cult persisted because it offered something more powerful than truth. It offered certainty, belonging, and the comfort of submitting to a leader who promised to solve every problem if only the people would obey. Mussolini had become a god, and in doing so, he had made Italy a nation of believers in a faith built on lies. Mussolini had always spoken of empire. From the moment he seized power, he invoked the memory of Rome, the legions, the conquests that had made the Mediterranean an Italian lake. But for more than a decade, the rhetoric remained just that, words spoken from balconies, slogans printed in newspapers, fantasies disconnected from reality. Italy was poor, its military outdated, its resources limited. The other European powers had carved up Africa and Asia among themselves, and there was little left to claim. But Mussolini was not interested in practicality. He was interested in glory, in proving that Fascist Italy was a great power, in creating a spectacle that would justify the cult he had built around himself. In 1935, he found his target, Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations left in Africa, a kingdom of mountains and plateaus ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie. Mussolini decided it would be his, and he did not care what it cost. The pretext was manufactured. Italian and Ethiopian forces clashed at the border town of Walwal in December 1934, a minor skirmish in a disputed region. Mussolini seized on the incident, demanding reparations and using Ethiopia's refusal as justification for invasion. He began mobilizing troops, shipping soldiers and equipment to Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, the colonies that bordered Ethiopia to the south and north. The build-up took months, and it was impossible to hide. The world watched, and the League of Nations, the international body created after World War I to prevent exactly this kind of aggression, issued warnings and called for arbitration. Mussolini ignored them. He had watched Japan invade Manchuria and faced no real consequences. He had watched Germany rearm in violation of the Versailles Treaty and face no real consequences. He understood that the League was hollow, that its members had no appetite for war, that condemnation without enforcement was meaningless. On October 3, 1935, Italian forces crossed the border into Ethiopia. The invasion was not a war between equals. Italy brought a modern mechanized army, tanks, trucks, aircraft, artillery. Ethiopia had rifles, some outdated cannons, and an army composed largely of tribal levies armed with spears and swords. The Italian commanders, Pietro Badoglio and Rodolfo Graziani, were given clear orders: crush all resistance, use whatever means necessary, and do it quickly. Mussolini wanted a spectacle, not a protracted conflict. He wanted victory parades and newsreels showing Italian soldiers marching through conquered territory. He wanted the world to see that Italy was a force to be feared. What he unleashed was atrocity on a scale that shocked even the cynical governments of Europe. The Italians used poison gas. They dropped canisters of mustard gas from aircraft, watching as the yellow clouds drifted over Ethiopian positions, over villages, over farmland. The gas burned skin, blinded eyes, seared lungs. Soldiers collapsed, choking, their bodies covered in blisters. Civilians fled, but there was nowhere to go. The gas settled in valleys, clung to vegetation, contaminated water sources. Entire villages were abandoned, their inhabitants dead or dying. The use of chemical weapons had been banned by the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which Italy had signed. Mussolini did not care. He authorized the use of gas repeatedly, and the Italian Air Force dropped thousands of canisters over the course of the war. When reports reached Europe, the League of Nations condemned the attacks, but they did nothing to stop them. Mussolini had calculated correctly. The world would watch and do nothing. The Italian advance was accompanied by systematic brutality. Graziani, commanding the Southern Front, ordered mass executions of prisoners and suspected rebels. Ethiopian soldiers captured in battle were shot or hanged in public. Civilians accused of supporting the resistance were killed without trial. Villages suspected of harboring fighters were burned, their inhabitants massacred. The Italian forces used aerial bombardment not just against military targets but against Red Cross hospitals, clearly marked with the international symbol of neutrality. Pilots dropped bombs on field hospitals, killing doctors, nurses, and wounded soldiers. The attacks were deliberate, designed to terrorize the population and destroy any organized resistance. Badoglio sent a telegram to Rome after one particularly brutal operation, reporting that he had ordered the use of gas and the execution of all males over the age of 12 in a captured town. Mussolini's response was approval. Haile Selassie and his forces resisted as best they could. Ethiopian troops fought with extraordinary courage, launching desperate charges against Italian machine gun positions, enduring bombardment and gas attacks, holding out in mountain strongholds even as the front collapsed. But courage was not enough. By May 1936, Italian forces entered Addis Ababa, the capital. Haile Selassie fled into exile, eventually reaching Geneva, where he addressed the League of Nations in a speech that was both a plea for help and an indictment of the international order. He warned that the aggression against Ethiopia was a prelude to a larger catastrophe, that if the League did not act, the violence would spread. He was ignored. The major powers were too distracted by their own concerns, too unwilling to risk conflict with Italy, too invested in maintaining the appearance of peace. Mussolini had won. On May 9, 1936, Mussolini stood on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome and addressed a crowd of hundreds of thousands. He declared that Ethiopia was now part of the Italian Empire, that the legacy of Rome had been restored, that Italy had taken its place among the great powers. The crowd roared. Church bells rang across the city. The king was proclaimed Emperor of Ethiopia, and the regime organized celebrations that lasted for days. Newspapers printed special editions proclaiming the birth of a new empire. Schoolchildren were given the day off to march in parades. The propaganda machine presented the conquest as a triumph of civilization over barbarism, a mission to bring progress and order to a backward land. The atrocities were not hidden, but they were reframed. The use of gas was described as a necessary measure against a savage enemy. The massacres were justified as reprisals against guerrillas who violated the laws of war. The destruction of hospitals was blamed on the Ethiopians for using them as military positions. The regime constructed a narrative in which Italy was the victim and the civilizer, forced to use harsh methods against an uncivilized foe. The reality was different. The war in Ethiopia was not a civilizing mission. It was a war of extermination, designed to crush a sovereign nation and to demonstrate that Fascist Italy would not be constrained by international law or moral scruple. The use of chemical weapons, the massacres of civilians, the deliberate targeting of medical facilities, these were not aberrations or unfortunate necessities. They were policy, approved at the highest levels, carried out systematically. Mussolini wanted empire, and he was willing to commit atrocity to get it. The conquest of Ethiopia revealed what fascism was beneath the rhetoric of renewal and greatness. It was a system built on violence, on the belief that strength justified any action, on the conviction that the weak existed to be dominated and destroyed. The war killed hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians, soldiers and civilians alike. It destabilized the region for decades. It demonstrated to the world that the international order created after World War I was incapable of preventing aggression. And it emboldened Mussolini. He had gambled that the world would not stop him, and he had been proven right. The conquest of Ethiopia was not the end of his ambitions. It was the beginning. He had tasted empire, and he wanted more. Mussolini had watched Adolf Hitler's rise with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. When the Austrian-born agitator first attempted a coup in Munich in 1923, Mussolini dismissed him as an amateur, a crude imitator of fascism without the discipline or intelligence to succeed. But Hitler learned from failure, and by 1933 he had maneuvered himself into power in Germany through a combination of electoral manipulation and backroom deals that Mussolini recognized and grudgingly respected. Hitler admired Mussolini, called him the pioneer of fascism, and sent emissaries to Rome bearing flattery and proposals for cooperation. Mussolini was suspicious at first. Germany was historically Italy's rival, and a strong Germany threatened Italian interests in Austria and the Balkans. But as the 1930s progressed, Mussolini's calculations shifted. The democracies, Britain and France, had done nothing to stop his invasion of Ethiopia. They had condemned him, isolated him diplomatically, but they had not acted. Hitler, on the other hand, offered alliance, recognition, and the prospect of reshaping Europe together. Mussolini began to see opportunity where he had once seen threat. The turning point came in 1936. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in violation of the Versailles Treaty, and the French did nothing. Mussolini watched and understood that the balance of power was shifting. Later that year, both Italy and Germany intervened in the Spanish Civil War, supporting Francisco Franco's fascist rebellion against the Spanish Republic. Italian troops and aircraft fought alongside German forces, and the collaboration deepened the bond between the two regimes. In October 1936, Mussolini announced the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis, a political and military alignment that would dominate European affairs for the next decade. He framed the alliance as a partnership of equals, two revolutionary powers standing against the decadent democracies and the Bolshevik threat. But the reality was more complicated. Hitler was rapidly building Germany into the most powerful military force in Europe, while Italy remained weak, its economy stagnant, its military outdated. Mussolini knew this, but he could not admit it, not to Hitler and not to himself. He had built his entire identity on the myth of Italian strength, and to acknowledge weakness would be to undermine everything he had constructed. Hitler pushed, and Mussolini followed. In 1938, when Hitler annexed Austria, Mussolini raised no objection, despite his earlier opposition to German expansion. He had become dependent on the alliance, unwilling to risk isolation by challenging his only major ally. Later that year, at the Munich conference, Mussolini played the role of mediator, helping to broker the agreement that handed the Sudetenland to Germany. He was praised by the Western powers for his statesmanship, and he returned to Rome believing he had demonstrated Italy's importance on the world stage. But the reality was that he had simply enabled Hitler's aggression and received nothing in return. The dynamic of the relationship was already clear. Hitler led, and Mussolini followed, trying to keep up, trying to maintain the illusion of equality. In 1938, Mussolini imported one of the most toxic elements of Nazi ideology, anti-Semitism. Italy had never been particularly anti-Semitic. Jews had lived in Italy for centuries, integrated into society, contributing to commerce, science, and the arts. Mussolini himself had dismissed racial theories as absurd and had Jewish friends and advisors. But as the alliance with Hitler deepened, he decided that Italy needed its own racial laws to demonstrate ideological alignment with Germany. In the autumn of 1938, the regime issued a series of decrees banning Jews from public employment, from schools, from military service. Jewish businesses were confiscated. Jewish children were expelled from classrooms. Marriages between Jews and non-Jews were prohibited. The laws were enacted without popular demand, imposed from above purely as a political calculation. Most Italians were indifferent or uncomfortable, but they did not resist. The machinery of the totalitarian state ensured compliance. Jews who had considered themselves Italian, who had fought for Italy in the Great War, who had supported the regime, were suddenly rendered alien, cast out of the national community. It was an act of cruelty without purpose, undertaken not because Mussolini believed in racial purity but because he wanted to please Hitler and demonstrate that Fascist Italy was as radical as Nazi Germany. In April 1939, Mussolini invaded Albania. It was a minor operation, barely a war, more an annexation of a weak neighbor that had long been within Italy's sphere of influence. But Mussolini presented it as a great victory, another step in the restoration of the Roman Empire. King Zog fled, and Albania was absorbed into the Italian state. Mussolini stood on his balcony and proclaimed triumph, but the conquest was hollow. It impressed no one, least of all Hitler, who was preparing for something far larger. In May 1939, Mussolini signed the Pact of Steel, a formal military alliance with Germany that committed Italy to support Germany in any future conflict. Mussolini's foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, warned him that Italy was not ready for war, that the military was poorly equipped, that the economy could not sustain a prolonged conflict. Mussolini ignored him. He believed that war was inevitable, that Italy had to be on the winning side, and that the side with Germany was the winning side. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering World War II, Mussolini hesitated. He declared that Italy would remain neutral, citing the need for more time to prepare. It was a humiliating admission of weakness, and Mussolini felt it deeply. He watched as German forces smashed through Poland in weeks, as Hitler's Wehrmacht demonstrated a speed and power that dwarfed anything Italy could field. Mussolini grew increasingly agitated. He felt sidelined, irrelevant, a spectator while history was being made. In the spring of 1940, as Germany invaded France and achieved victories that stunned the world, Mussolini could no longer restrain himself. He convinced himself that the war was nearly over, that Germany had already won, and that if Italy did not act immediately, it would be shut out of the spoils. On June 10, 1940, he declared war on France and Britain. He did so without adequately preparing the military, without securing sufficient resources, without any realistic assessment of Italy's capacity to fight. He entered the war because he could not bear to be left out, because his ego demanded it, because he believed his own propaganda about Italian strength. The miscalculation became apparent almost immediately. Italian forces invaded southern France but achieved almost nothing before the French surrender. Mussolini demanded territorial concessions, but Hitler, who had done all the fighting, gave him almost nothing. The humiliation stung, but worse was to come. In October 1940, Mussolini decided to invade Greece from Albania, believing it would be a quick campaign that would demonstrate Italian prowess and balance Germany's conquests. He did not consult Hitler. He did not adequately prepare his generals. He launched the invasion with insufficient troops, poor logistics, and no coherent plan. The Greeks, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, fought back with ferocity. They stopped the Italian advance, then counterattacked, driving Italian forces back into Albania. The Italian army, demoralized and poorly led, collapsed in disarray. Mussolini had promised a swift victory and delivered a catastrophic defeat. In North Africa, the situation was equally dire. Italian forces, vastly superior in numbers to the small British contingent in Egypt, launched an offensive in September 1940. They advanced slowly, cautiously, and then stopped. In December, the British counterattacked. The Italian army disintegrated. Tens of thousands of soldiers surrendered. Equipment was abandoned. Entire divisions ceased to exist. By early 1941, the British had advanced deep into Libya, threatening to destroy the Italian position in North Africa entirely. Mussolini was forced to beg Hitler for help. German forces arrived in Greece and North Africa, stabilizing the front, but the cost was clear. Italy was no longer an equal partner. It was a dependent, a liability, kept in the war only by German intervention. The Italian people, who had been told for years that their military was invincible, began to understand the truth. The defeats could not be hidden. Casualty lists grew. Rationing tightened. The war, which Mussolini had promised would be short and glorious, dragged on with no end in sight. The grandiosity that had defined the regime began to crack, revealing the emptiness beneath. Mussolini had gambled everything on the alliance with Hitler, on the belief that war would cement his legacy and prove Italy's greatness. Instead, the war was exposing Italy's weakness and his own failures as a leader. The defeats in Greece and North Africa were not isolated setbacks. They were the beginning of a collapse that would consume the regime and the man who had built it. By the summer of 1943, Italy was breaking. The war that Mussolini had entered with such confidence 3 years earlier had become a catastrophe from which there was no escape. Allied bombers struck Italian cities almost daily, reducing neighborhoods to rubble, killing thousands of civilians, destroying factories and rail lines and ports. Rome, the Eternal City, the symbol of the empire Mussolini claimed to have restored, was bombed for the first time in July. The population watched the sky fill with aircraft and felt the ground shake as bombs fell on the San Lorenzo district, killing over 1,000 people and obliterating homes that had stood for centuries. The myth of invincibility, carefully constructed over 2 decades, dissolved in fire and dust. Rationing had reduced the population to near starvation. Bread was scarce. Meat was a memory. People queued for hours to receive portions so small they barely sustained life. The black market flourished, but only the wealthy could afford it. Workers in the cities grew thin and angry. Farmers hoarded what little they had. The regime's promises of glory and greatness had delivered only hunger and death. The military situation was beyond recovery. In North Africa, the Italian and German forces had been crushed. Over 200,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, including tens of thousands of Italians who laid down their weapons without resistance. The loss of North Africa opened the Mediterranean to Allied invasion, and everyone knew Italy would be next. On July 10, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The invasion force was enormous, over 3,000 ships, hundreds of thousands of troops, overwhelming air support. The Italian divisions tasked with defending the island collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers deserted, officers abandoned their posts, entire units melted away. The Germans fought harder, but they too were eventually forced to retreat across the Strait of Messina to the mainland. Within weeks, Sicily was lost. The Allies now stood at the edge of the Italian peninsula, and there was nothing to stop them. Mussolini was paralyzed. He spent his days in the Palazzo Venezia, issuing orders that were ignored, receiving reports that confirmed only disaster. His health was deteriorating. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, likely an ulcer aggravated by stress. He slept poorly, ate little, and aged visibly. He had built a regime around the cult of his own strength, but now he was weak, and everyone could see it. His subordinates whispered. His ministers stopped pretending to respect him. Even his son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, who had served as foreign minister and had once been a devoted fascist, began to distance himself, understanding that the regime was doomed and that loyalty to Mussolini would mean sharing his fate. The machinery of dictatorship, which had functioned smoothly for so long, began to seize up. Orders went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. The apparatus of control, built on fear and submission, faltered because there was nothing left to control. The people had stopped believing, and without belief, terror alone was insufficient. The Fascist Grand Council, a body that had not met in years and had served primarily as a rubber stamp for Mussolini's decisions, convened on the night of July 24, 1943. The meeting took place in the Palazzo Venezia, in a long room with high ceilings and frescoed walls. 28 men sat around a table, most of them senior fascists who had been with Mussolini since the beginning: Dino Grandi, Galeazzo Ciano, Giuseppe Bottai, Cesare Maria De Vecchi. They had spent 2 decades enabling him, celebrating him, enforcing his will. Now they were here to betray him. The session lasted 10 hours, stretching past midnight. Mussolini sat at the head of the table, exhausted and defensive, arguing that the war could still be won if Italy fought harder, if the people showed more discipline, if the Allies could be held at bay long enough for German reinforcements to arrive. No one believed him. Grandi, who had long harbored resentment toward Mussolini, presented a motion calling for the restoration of the king's constitutional powers and the reactivation of parliament. It was a polite way of saying that Mussolini had to go. The vote was taken in the early hours of July 25. 19 members voted in favor. Mussolini had been repudiated by his own council. He left the meeting in silence, his face pale, his body stiff. He did not sleep. The next afternoon, he was summoned to meet with King Victor Emmanuel III at the Villa Ada. Mussolini went, believing the king would support him, that they would discuss the military situation and perhaps reorganize the government. He arrived in uniform, and the king received him in a small room. The conversation was brief. Victor Emmanuel told Mussolini that the war was lost, that the country hated him, that the army would no longer follow his orders. He told him that Marshal Pietro Badoglio would replace him as head of government. Mussolini tried to argue, but the king cut him off. It was over. As Mussolini left the villa, Carabinieri officers approached him and informed him that he was under arrest. He was placed in an ambulance, driven away from Rome, and taken into custody. There was no struggle, no dramatic resistance. He simply got into the vehicle and disappeared. The news spread quickly. Within hours, Rome erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets, tearing down fascist symbols, ripping posters of Mussolini from walls, smashing statues. They sang, they danced, they embraced strangers. The regime that had controlled every aspect of their lives for more than 20 years was gone, and the relief was overwhelming. In cities across Italy, similar scenes unfolded. Fascist officials went into hiding. Party headquarters were ransacked. The people who had saluted and chanted and obeyed now turned on the symbols of the dictatorship with a fury born of years of suppressed rage. But the celebration was premature. The war was not over. The Germans were still in Italy, and they would not leave willingly. Mussolini was moved from prison to prison, taken to remote locations to prevent rescue or assassination. He was held on the island of Ponza, then transferred to a hotel on the island of La Maddalena, and finally to a mountain resort at Campo Imperatore in the Gran Sasso, high in the Apennines. The location was isolated, accessible only by cable car, surrounded by cliffs and thin air. He was guarded by carabinieri who treated him with a mixture of contempt and indifference. He was no longer Il Duce. He was a prisoner, an old man in a cheap suit, irrelevant and forgotten. He spent his days reading, writing letters that were never sent, staring out at the mountains. He had no power, no followers, no purpose. The man who had claimed to embody Italy had been discarded by the very institutions, the king, the Grand Council, the military, that he had used to seize and maintain power. The collapse had not come through heroic resistance or popular uprising. It had come through exhaustion, betrayal, and the quiet recognition that he was no longer useful. Badoglio's government began secret negotiations with the Allies, seeking an armistice that would take Italy out of the war. The talks were conducted in secrecy, but the Germans suspected. Hitler, enraged by Mussolini's fall and anticipating Italian surrender, ordered German forces to occupy the country. On September 8, 1943, the armistice was announced. Italy switched sides, or tried to. The Italian army, receiving no clear orders, disintegrated. Soldiers deserted, officers fled, units surrendered to the Germans or simply went home. The Germans seized Rome, disarmed Italian forces, and took control of the northern half of the country. The king and Badoglio fled south, abandoning Rome to the occupation. Italy was no longer a single nation. It was a divided, occupied territory, and the war that Mussolini had started would now be fought on Italian soil, destroying what little remained. The man who had promised to restore the glory of Rome had delivered only ruin, and he was not even present to witness it. On September 12, 1943, German commandos arrived at Campo Imperatore. They came in gliders, landing on the rocky plateau near the hotel where Mussolini was being held. The operation was led by Otto Skorzeny, an SS officer who had been personally ordered by Hitler to retrieve Mussolini at any cost. The Carabinieri guards, outnumbered and unwilling to die for a man who had already fallen, surrendered without resistance. Mussolini was found in his room, unshaven and confused, wearing a rumpled suit. He had not expected rescue. He had begun to believe that his political life was over, that he would spend the rest of his days in obscurity or perhaps be handed over to the Allies for trial. Skorzeny told him that the Führer had sent them, that Germany had not abandoned him. Mussolini was taken to a small aircraft, flown to Vienna, and then brought to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The two men met, and Hitler told Mussolini what would happen next. He would return to Italy. He would lead a new government in the north. He would rally the fascists and continue the fight. It was not a request. It was an order. Mussolini had no choice. He was entirely dependent on German protection, German resources, German will. Without Hitler, he was nothing, a fugitive, a prisoner, a man with no followers and no power. He agreed because refusal was impossible. In late September, he was installed as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state that controlled the northern half of Italy, the half still under German occupation. The new regime established its capital in the small town of Salo, on the shores of Lake Garda, far from Rome, far from the symbols of the empire he had once claimed to embody. The choice of location was itself a humiliation. Salo was a resort town, pleasant and provincial, utterly unsuited to be the seat of government. But it was safe from Allied bombing and close to the German border, and those were the only considerations that mattered now. The Italian Social Republic was a grotesque parody of the regime Mussolini had built. It had all the trappings, ministries, uniforms, flags, proclamations, but none of the substance. Real power rested with the Germans, who occupied the country, controlled the economy, and directed military operations. Mussolini signed decrees that were ignored. He issued orders that were countermanded by German commanders. He made speeches that no one listened to. The regime's sole function was to provide a veneer of Italian legitimacy to German occupation and to serve as a tool for extracting resources and labor from the population. Mussolini understood this, and the understanding ate at him. He had spent his life accumulating power, and now he was powerless, a figurehead in a regime that existed only because Hitler willed it. His physical decline mirrored his political irrelevance. He was 60 years old, but he looked older. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin gray. The ulcers that had plagued him for years worsened, causing constant pain that he tried to mask. He suffered from insomnia, spending nights awake in the villa that served as his residence, staring at walls, replaying the decisions that had brought him to this point. He had little contact with his family. His wife Rochelle and their younger children had joined him, but the relationship was strained. His mistress, Clara Petacci, remained by his side, loyal to the end, but her presence was a reminder of his indulgences, of the vanity and appetite that had defined him. He spent much of his time alone, reading, writing in journals that no one would ever publish, waiting for meetings that accomplished nothing. The Italian Social Republic was a regime of vengeance and terror. Mussolini, impotent in most matters, retained one power, the ability to punish. He signed execution orders for the men who had voted against him in the fascist Grand Council, the men who had betrayed him. Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law, the man who had once been his closest confidant, was arrested, tried in a kangaroo court, and sentenced to death. Ciano's wife Edda, Mussolini's daughter, begged her father to spare him. She pleaded, threatened, wept. Mussolini refused. On January 11, 1944, Ciano and 4 others were tied to chairs and shot in the back by a firing squad in Verona. Mussolini justified the executions as necessary, as justice for traitors. But they were also acts of spite, the last assertion of authority by a man who had lost everything else. The killings accomplished nothing. They did not restore his power or his reputation. They simply confirmed what everyone already knew, that he was cruel, petty, and finished. The war continued, and Italy was destroyed. The Allies advanced slowly up the peninsula, fighting the Germans in brutal campaigns through mountains and rivers and fortified lines. Italian cities were bombed into ruins. Factories were obliterated. Infrastructure collapsed. Tens of thousands of Italians were killed, not by foreign armies but by the war Mussolini had brought to their doorstep. In the north, the Italian Social Republic attempted to mobilize troops, but conscription efforts failed. Young men fled to the mountains to join partisan bands rather than fight for a regime they despised. The partisans, communists, socialists, Catholics, monarchists united by their hatred of fascism, waged guerrilla war against the Germans and the remnants of the fascist militias. They ambushed convoys, sabotaged rail lines, assassinated collaborators. The Germans retaliated with mass executions, burning villages and killing civilians in reprisal for partisan attacks. Mussolini issued proclamations condemning the partisans as bandits and terrorists, but his words had no weight. The population saw him as irrelevant at best, complicit at worst. In Salo, Mussolini existed in a state of suspension, waiting for an end he could not control. He gave interviews to journalists, still attempting to shape his legacy, still insisting that history would vindicate him. He spoke of betrayal, of how the Italian people had failed him, of how he had been abandoned by cowards and opportunists. He never accepted responsibility for the disaster. He blamed the king, the generals, the socialists, the allies, everyone but himself. He clung to the belief that he had been a great man brought down by lesser men, that his vision had been correct and only the execution had failed. It was a delusion, but it was all he had left. The regime in Salo produced nothing of value. It did not govern. It did not rebuild. It did not inspire. It simply existed, a shadow of a shadow, propped up by German bayonets and sustained by inertia. Mussolini held meetings with ministers who had no authority, reviewed military plans that would never be implemented, and signed documents that meant nothing. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of the state he had destroyed. The man who had once stood on balconies before hundreds of thousands, who had commanded armies and proclaimed empire, now shuffled through empty rooms in a provincial villa, signing execution orders and waiting for the end. The cult of Il Duce was dead. The myth of strength and infallibility had been shattered. What remained was a tired, sick old man, clinging to the remnants of power because he had nothing else to cling to. The degradation was complete, and there was no way back. By April 1945, the Italian Social Republic was collapsing. The Allies had broken through the Gothic Line, the last major German defensive position in northern Italy, and were advancing rapidly across the Po Valley. German forces were retreating in disorder, abandoning equipment, blowing bridges, trying to reach the Alps before they were encircled. The puppet government in Salo was dissolving. Ministers fled. Officials burned documents. The partisans, sensing victory, intensified their attacks, seizing towns, executing collaborators, settling scores that had been accumulating for 2 years. Mussolini remained in his villa on Lake Garda, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists and German officers who no longer took his orders seriously. He held meetings that accomplished nothing. He signed decrees that would never be enforced. He waited for instructions from the Germans, but the Germans were too busy retreating to care about his fate. On April 18, Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan, attempted to mediate a surrender. He invited Mussolini and representatives of the partisan leadership to meet in his residence in Milan. Mussolini came, perhaps hoping that some negotiated solution could spare him from capture. The partisans demanded unconditional surrender. Mussolini stalled, insisting he needed to consult with the Germans. But when he learned that the Germans had already begun negotiating their own separate surrender with the Allies, he realized he had been abandoned. There would be no deal, no guarantee of safety. He left the Archbishop's residence and returned to his entourage, knowing that his options had run out. He could surrender to the Allies and face trial, or he could try to flee. He chose flight. Mussolini's plan, such as it was, involved reaching the Valtellina, a mountainous region near the Swiss border where a few thousand loyal fascists had supposedly gathered. He imagined making a last stand, holding out in the mountains, prolonging the struggle. It was a fantasy. There was no organized force waiting for him, no defensive position prepared, no hope of meaningful resistance. But he clung to the idea because the alternative, surrender, capture, humiliation, was unbearable. On April 25, he left Milan with a small convoy of vehicles carrying fascist officials, German soldiers, and his mistress Clara Petacci, who had refused to leave him. They drove north toward Lake Como, moving slowly through roads clogged with refugees and retreating German troops. The atmosphere was chaotic, desperate, the final hours of a regime that had already ceased to exist. By April 27, Mussolini and his convoy had reached the town of Dongo, on the western shore of Lake Como. They joined a German motorized column that was attempting to retreat into Germany. Mussolini, hoping to avoid recognition, put on a German greatcoat and helmet, trying to blend in with the soldiers. It was a pathetic disguise. He was 61 years old, visibly unwell, his face known to every Italian. The convoy moved slowly, and near the village of Musso, it was stopped by a partisan roadblock. The partisans, members of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, demanded to inspect the vehicles. They were looking for fascists trying to escape. They checked documents, searched trucks, questioned soldiers. Mussolini sat in the back of a German truck, his collar pulled up, his head down, hoping to pass unnoticed. But one of the partisans, a man named Giuseppe Negri, recognized him. He had seen Mussolini's face in photographs and newsreels for more than 20 years. He knew exactly who was hiding under the German coat. Mussolini was pulled from the truck. He did not resist. He stood on the road, surrounded by armed partisans, and admitted his identity. Clara Petacci, traveling in another vehicle, demanded to be taken with him. The partisans allowed it, though they had no reason to. They were not interested in her. They put Mussolini and Clara in a car and drove them back to Dongo, then transferred them to a farmhouse in the nearby village of Giuliano di Mezzigra. The farmhouse was small, plain, owned by a family named De Maria. Mussolini and Clara were held in a ground-floor room. They were given no food, no explanation, no assurance. Partisan guards stood outside. Mussolini sat on a bed, silent, exhausted. He had been moving for days, sleeping little, eating less. He knew what was coming. The partisan leadership in Milan debated what to do with him. Some argued for turning him over to the Allies, who had requested that high-ranking fascists be delivered for trial. Others insisted that he be executed immediately, that the Italian people had the right to deliver justice themselves, that a trial would turn into a spectacle and allow Mussolini to pose as a martyr. The Communists, who dominated the partisan command in the north, made the decision. Mussolini would be executed. The order was given on the evening of April 27. A partisan commander named Walter Addizio, who used the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio, was assigned to carry out the sentence. Addizio arrived in Giuliano di Mezzigra on the afternoon of April 28. He was accompanied by a small group of partisans. They entered the farmhouse and told Mussolini and Clara to come with them. Mussolini asked where they were going. Addizio did not answer. They were taken outside and put into a car. The car drove a short distance and stopped near a gate leading to a villa called Villa Belmonte. The location was arbitrary, chosen simply because it was secluded. Mussolini and Clara were told to get out. They stood by the stone wall. Mussolini wore the same dark overcoat he had been wearing for days. Clara wore a fur coat, incongruous and elegant, a remnant of the life she had lived as the mistress of a dictator. Addizio read a brief sentence, declaring that by order of the General Command of the Corps of Volunteers for Freedom, Benito Mussolini was condemned to death. Mussolini opened his coat, baring his chest. He said something. Accounts differ on the exact words, either "shoot me in the chest" or simply "no." Clara moved toward him, trying to shield him with her body. Addizio raised his submachine gun and fired. The gun jammed. He took another weapon from one of the other partisans and fired again. Clara fell first, then Mussolini. They collapsed against the wall, their bodies slumping to the ground. Addizio fired additional shots to ensure they were dead. The execution took less than a minute. There was no ceremony, no final speech, no drama. It was simply done. The bodies were loaded into a van and driven to Milan. They were taken to Piazzale Loreto, a large square in the city where, months earlier, fascists had executed 15 partisans and left their bodies on display. The decision to bring Mussolini's corpse there was deliberate, symbolic. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and several other executed fascist officials were dumped on the pavement. A crowd gathered, growing rapidly as word spread. People came to see, to confirm, to participate in the final desecration of a man who had ruled them for more than 20 years. The bodies were kicked, spat upon, mutilated. Someone hung them upside down from the metal girders of a gas station, suspending them by their ankles. Mussolini's face, battered and bloodied, swung in the air above the crowd. The man who had stood on balconies and demanded worship now hung like meat in a public square, a spectacle of rage and retribution. There was no dignity in it, no reflection, no closure. It was simply the end. The bodies arrived in Milan before dawn on April 29, 1945, transported in a moving van that had been requisitioned by the partisans. Mussolini's corpse was wrapped in a blanket, along with Clara Petacci and the bodies of several other executed fascist officials, Achille Starace, the former secretary of the Fascist Party, Alessandro Pavlini, the Minister of Culture, and others who had remained loyal to the regime until the end. The van drove through empty streets, past shuttered shops and apartment buildings where people slept, unaware that the man who had ruled them for more than 2 decades was being delivered as cargo. The destination was Piazzale Loreto, a large square in the eastern part of the city, a place that already carried the weight of recent violence. In August 1944, fascist militiamen had executed 15 partisans and anti-fascist civilians in the square and left their bodies on display for an entire day as a warning. The choice to bring Mussolini's body there was deliberate, an act of symmetry and revenge. The van stopped near a gas station at the edge of the square. The bodies were unloaded and dumped onto the pavement in a heap. By the time the sun rose, word had spread. People began to gather, first in small groups, then in larger crowds, hundreds, then thousands. They came to see if it was true, if Il Duce was really dead, if the nightmare was over. Some approached cautiously, uncertain, needing to look closely at the face to believe it. Others came with anger, with years of suppressed rage finally given an outlet. The crowd grew loud, pressing forward, and the partisan guards who had brought the bodies made no effort to control the scene. They stood back and let it happen. The bodies lay on the ground for hours, exposed to the crowd. People kicked them, spat on them, shouted insults. Women who had lost sons and husbands in Mussolini's wars screamed at the corpse. Men who had been imprisoned or beaten by fascist squads came to witness the final humiliation of the man who had terrorized them. Children, brought by their parents or arriving on their own, threw stones and sticks. The bodies were defiled, trampled, dragged across the pavement. Clara Petacci's skirt was torn, her body exposed, and no one intervened. The violence was chaotic, cathartic, an eruption of emotions that had been suppressed by fear for decades. The crowd was not organized. It was not directed. It simply expressed what it felt, and what it felt was hatred. By mid-morning, someone decided that the bodies should be hung for better visibility. Partisan fighters attached ropes to the metal girders of the Esso gas station that stood at the corner of the square. The corpses were lifted, hoisted upside down, suspended by their ankles several feet above the ground. Mussolini's body hung beside Clara's, their faces swollen and battered, their clothes stained with blood and dirt. The crowd pressed closer, craning to see, pointing, taking photographs. Some climbed onto the gas station structure to get a better view. Others simply stood and stared, trying to process what they were seeing. The image was grotesque, a tableau of total degradation. The man who had been worshipped, whose image had been displayed on every wall, who had demanded absolute obedience, now hung like an animal carcass in a public square. The display continued for hours. Journalists arrived and took photographs that would be published in newspapers around the world. Newsreel cameras captured footage of the crowd, of the bodies swaying slightly in the breeze, of people reaching up to touch the corpses or strike them. The scene was chaotic and uncontrolled, and eventually authorities grew concerned that the violence would spiral further, that the crowd might turn on other targets or that the spectacle would become an embarrassment. By late afternoon, the bodies were taken down and removed. They were transported to the city morgue, where they were cleaned, examined, and photographed for identification. Mussolini's body bore multiple bullet wounds, signs of beatings inflicted after death, and the marks of mutilation. His face was barely recognizable, the jaw broken, the features distorted by trauma and decay. The world saw the photographs. In London and Washington and Moscow, politicians and military leaders looked at images of Mussolini's corpse hanging upside down and understood that the Italian fascist experiment had ended in total collapse. In Germany, where Hitler was trapped in his bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet forces closed in, the photographs reportedly influenced his decision to take his own life rather than risk capture and similar humiliation. In Italy, the images were both celebrated and mourned. For those who had suffered under fascism, the display was justice, a necessary reckoning, a public demonstration that the dictator who had seemed invincible was mortal and defeated. For others, the spectacle was disturbing, a descent into barbarism that reflected poorly on those who participated. There were debates about whether the execution should have been conducted differently, whether a trial would have been more appropriate, whether the desecration of the bodies dishonored Italy itself. But these debates were abstract, removed from the raw emotion of the moment. The people in Piazzale Loreto were not thinking about legality or posterity. They were reacting to years of violence, lies, and fear. Mussolini had built his regime on terror, on the systematic use of brutality to crush opposition and enforce submission. He had ordered the murder of political opponents, the torture of dissidents, the bombing of civilians in Ethiopia, the execution of partisans. He had dragged Italy into a catastrophic war that killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed the country. The violence inflicted on his corpse was not random. It was a response to the violence he had unleashed. The crowd in the square was not a mob detached from history. It was history asserting itself, the accumulated consequences of 2 decades of dictatorship expressing themselves in the only language the regime had taught, force. The man who built his power on violence was destroyed by it. There was a symmetry to the end, a logic that was brutal and inescapable. Mussolini had believed that strength was the only virtue, that the weak deserved to be dominated, that history belonged to those willing to use force without restraint. He had lived by that belief, and he died by it. The crowd that mutilated his corpse was applying the same principle he had applied to others. He had shown no mercy, and he received none. He had demanded absolute power, and he received absolute rejection. The images from Piazzale Loreto were horrifying, but they were not inexplicable. They were the final chapter of a story that Mussolini himself had written, the inevitable conclusion of a life built on cruelty and ambition. The body was eventually buried in an unmarked grave in a Milan cemetery, but even that was not the end. Fascist sympathizers stole the corpse in 1946 and hid it for months, hoping to turn Mussolini into a martyr. The remains were recovered and held by the government for years before finally being returned to his family in 1957. He was buried in Predappio, the village where he was born, in a crypt that became a pilgrimage site for neo-fascists. But the spectacle in Piazzale Loreto remained the defining image of his death, the moment when the myth of Il Duce was destroyed completely. The man who had stood on balconies before hundreds of thousands, who had claimed to embody the will of the Italian people, who had demanded worship and obedience, ended upside down in a public square, reviled and broken. The violence he had inflicted came back to him, and there was no escaping it. The images were cold, factual, and final. They showed what happened when a dictator fell, when the institutions he had destroyed reasserted themselves not through law but through rage. It was an ending without dignity, without redemption, without ambiguity. It was simply the end. Mussolini left behind a country in ruins. When the war ended in May 1945, Italy was physically and spiritually shattered. Cities lay in rubble, their centers reduced to broken stone and twisted metal by years of Allied bombing and German occupation. Roads and bridges had been destroyed, railways torn up, ports reduced to debris. The industrial capacity that Mussolini had once boasted about was gone, factories dismantled or bombed into uselessness. Agricultural production had collapsed. Millions were homeless, living in makeshift shelters or the shells of buildings. The economy was paralyzed, the currency worthless, the black market the only functioning system of exchange. Over 400,000 Italians had died in the war, soldiers and civilians alike, and countless more carried wounds that would never fully heal. The infrastructure of daily life, schools, hospitals, water systems, electricity grids, had been damaged or neglected to the point of failure. Italy would take decades to recover, and some scars would never fade. The political landscape was equally devastated. The institutions that had governed Italy before fascism, the constitutional monarchy, the liberal parliamentary system, the rule of law, had been so thoroughly corrupted and discredited that they could not simply be restored. The monarchy survived the war but only briefly. King Victor Emmanuel III, who had enabled Mussolini's rise and waited too long to act against him, abdicated in 1946. His son Umberto II reigned for barely a month before a referendum abolished the monarchy altogether. Italy became a republic, but the transition was fraught with tension. The country was divided between those who had supported the resistance and those who had collaborated with fascism, between communists and Catholics and liberals who distrusted each other almost as much as they had distrusted Mussolini. The process of rebuilding democracy was slow and fragile, complicated by the Cold War, by economic hardship, and by the presence of millions of Italians who had been fascists, who had participated in the regime, and who now had to be integrated into a new political order. Mussolini's ideological legacy was more insidious than the physical destruction. Fascism as a formal political movement was discredited, banned, driven underground. But the ideas that had sustained it, the belief in strong leadership, the distrust of democracy, the glorification of violence, the appeal to national greatness, did not disappear. They lingered in the margins, in small neo-fascist groups that continued to meet, to publish, to recruit. They persisted in the rhetoric of authoritarian movements around the world, adapted and repackaged for new contexts. Fascism had demonstrated a model for seizing and maintaining power, a toolkit for destroying democratic institutions from within, and that model was studied by dictators and would-be dictators in other countries. The symbols Mussolini had used, the raised arm salute, the appeal to ancient glory, the cult of the leader, reappeared in different settings, sometimes explicitly fascist, sometimes dressed in new language but animated by the same impulses. The question that haunted Italy, and that haunts any society that has experienced totalitarianism, is how it happened. How did a democratic country, flawed but functional, allow itself to be taken over by a man like Mussolini? How did millions of people come to accept, support, or at least tolerate a regime that destroyed their freedoms and led them into catastrophe? The answers are not simple. Mussolini rose because Italian democracy was weak, because the institutions that should have resisted him were paralyzed by fear and self-interest, because the elites believed they could control him and use him for their own purposes. He rose because the left was divided and the center was exhausted and the right was willing to tolerate fascism as a bulwark against communism. He rose because economic crisis and social instability created desperation, and desperate people are willing to follow anyone who promises order and purpose. He rose because violence worked, because terror silenced opposition, because the state allowed it to happen. But Mussolini also rose because people wanted what he offered. Not everyone, not even a majority at first, but enough. Enough people were tired of instability and willing to trade freedom for the promise of security. Enough people were attracted to the spectacle, to the parades and the speeches and the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Enough people believed the propaganda, or chose to believe it, because the alternative was to confront uncomfortable truths about their country and themselves. Fascism was not imposed on Italy by force alone. It was enabled by complicity, by the millions of small decisions people made to look away, to stay silent, to participate in rituals they knew were hollow because participation was easier than resistance. The regime understood this and exploited it, creating a system where belief and obedience became indistinguishable, where the performance of loyalty was enough. The survivors of the war, the men and women who had endured fascism and fought against it, struggled to make sense of what had happened. Some saw it as an aberration, a dark chapter that could be closed and moved beyond. Others understood that fascism had revealed something deeper, something unsettling about human nature and about the fragility of civilization. It had shown how quickly institutions could collapse, how easily people could be manipulated, how ordinary men and women could commit or condone atrocities when the structures that enforce morality and accountability were removed. It had shown that democracy was not self-sustaining, that it required constant vigilance, active participation, and a willingness to defend it even when that defense was costly. The physical remnants of Mussolini's regime were removed or recontextualized. Statues were torn down, monuments defaced, buildings renamed. The palazzo where he had given his speeches became a museum. The symbols of fascism were banned. But memory could not be legislated away. There were Italians who mourned Mussolini, who remembered the regime with nostalgia, who believed the propaganda about the trains running on time and the nation restored to greatness. There were others who could not forget the violence, the fear, the loss. Italy struggled to reconcile these competing memories, to create a narrative that acknowledged the past without glorifying it, that honored the resistance without demonizing everyone who had lived under fascism. The process was incomplete and remains so, because the past does not resolve neatly, because guilt and complicity are distributed unevenly, because the questions fascism raises do not have easy answers. Fascism did not end with Mussolini's death. It persisted as an idea, as a temptation, as a warning. Other countries would follow similar paths, other leaders would employ the same methods, the cult of personality, the rejection of democratic norms, the use of violence to silence opposition, the appeal to national grievance and the promise of restoration. The specific forms changed, but the underlying logic remained. Fascism was not unique to Italy or to the 1920s and 1930s. It was a response to modernity, to the anxieties and dislocations that come with rapid change, to the fear that traditional structures of meaning and authority are collapsing. It offered certainty in place of complexity, strength in place of deliberation, unity in place of pluralism. It promised to make the nation great again, to restore order, to punish enemies. And in every generation, there are people who find those promises appealing. The legacy of Mussolini is not a simple moral lesson. It is a reminder that democracy is fragile, that it can be destroyed not only by coups and invasions but by the slow erosion of norms, by the accumulation of compromises and surrenders, by the willingness of institutions and individuals to prioritize their own interests over the common good. It is a reminder that violence, once unleashed, is difficult to contain, that the logic of force tends to expand until it consumes everything. It is a reminder that people are capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary courage, often within the same society, sometimes within the same person. The story of fascism is not finished because the conditions that allowed it to flourish have not been eliminated. They recur in different forms, in different places, and the question remains, what allows a man like Mussolini to rise, and what allows a society to follow him? The answer is not fixed. It depends on choices, on institutions, on the willingness of people to resist when resistance is still possible. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it offers patterns, warnings, examples. Whether those warnings are heeded is never certain.